Turn the Couch Cage Side with your host Kyle Delaney from CouchFire.co. In this installment, I would like to go over the recent news about Fedor Emelianenko making the hint about making the move over to the UFC and possibility of fighting in the UFC. He was talking about how the best fighters, the better talent is in America. Obviously, that is in the promotion of the UFC. And, you know, this is a big stride. This is big news simply just because of what has happened in the past about the difficulties of getting Fedor Emelianenko over into the UFC and how the deal with M1 Global and Dana White and just everything, the drama that ensued with everything. This is big news. And this is not saying that a deal is going to happen, but Fedor's mindset about him wanting to come over here says a lot about what he wants to do. At the age of 35, he wants to come over and compete against the best, showing his warrior instinct and his spirit and just what he brings to the table and how he has lived and fought his entire career. So this is big news. So what my goal is in this video is the pros and cons in regards to this whole situation, the possibility of Fedor fighting in the UFC, and there are pros and cons that come with this. So that's my goal in this video. So what I'm going to start doing is just the pros, and simply, plain simple, is just you add Fedor Emelianenko to this already. I mean, and that's the thing is that everybody always questioned the heavyweight division in the beginning. Oh, the heavyweight division isn't that deep. You know, just like the middleweight division is not that deep. And I'm not saying that that's possible. This is just what people say. Okay, and the heavyweight division wasn't that deep in the beginning, but now it is such an exciting division. You have heavyweight. The heavyweight division is growing in talent, and we can continue to get new fighters. With the people crossing over from Strikeforce, people are going to win the Grand Prix and finding new talent, you know, the Glover, Texeiras. There's just a lot of talent coming into the heavyweight division. And adding Fedor Emelianenko would only be, it would be even bigger add to the heavyweight division. Now, those of you that question the legacy of Fedor Emelianenko and say whether he is a legend or whether he's washed up, it doesn't matter. And I think it simply just comes down to his fighting style. Fedor Emelianenko has never dogged it. He's never taken any fights off, and he always brings it. That's the best thing about what makes Fedor so marketable is simply his fighting style and his ability to bring the fight. He fights fearless. And I think the best thing about, not only does he fight fearless, but I think at the age of 35, he is starting to evolve as a fighter. We've seen in his past two fights against Monson and Ishii, I'm not saying this is against the best talent, but we've seen Fedor Emelianenko fight smart and with a game plan, and it shows that he is evolving because Fedor fought fearless but also reckless at the same time. I'm not here to say that Fedor is a bad fighter, but he did fight reckless. And the game of MMA is evolving, and he is evolving along with it at the age of 35, and it is impressive. And one could only imagine what a talented fighter like Fedor could do with a game plan in the UFC. Now, I'm not saying he's going to come over and win all the fights and he's going to be the next champion, and it is a possibility. Anything's always possible in MMA, but Fedor would be a big get for the heavyweight division in the UFC, whatever division he fights in. Obviously, it would be the heavyweight division. And also, it's just the name. Fedor Emelianenko, what comes along with the name is obviously money. With any promotion, money is king, and it is business. Fedor Emelianenko is a name that you can sell. Now, I'm not saying he's going to go out and get Brock Lesnar numbers with pay-per-views or whatever card you sell, but Fedor Emelianenko is a name, and people will most definitely tune in to watch it simply just because of his talent, his fighting style, what he brings, what dynamic he brings to the table, but also the name itself, and you know, and also the backstory behind it. Can Fedor Emelianenko, this fighter who's considered the greatest of all time, one of the long undefeated and undisputed heavyweight champions in Pride, how is he going to do in the UFC against the best at his age? And that is it. There is a big story behind this. You could pitch it however you want, but there is a big story that you can pitch with this, Fedor Emelianenko crossing over and fighting in the UFC. It is big. And also, like I said before, there is big money. Fedor Emelianenko is one of the most popular athletes in Russia. Obviously, Sambo being the national sport in Russia goes to show that. But Fedor Emelianenko, it's also just how marketable he is. He's a class act. He's a good fighter, and he brings a lot to the table. So he is marketable if he comes over and he starts to win, and he will sell out and he will be a big draw for the UFC. So there are a lot of pros that go along with it. It has to do with his fighting style, his name, and just the whole story behind it. So those are the pros that I have in regards to Fedor Emelianenko coming over into the UFC. And there are cons. That's what I would like to go over in this. There are cons if Fedor Emelianenko does come over to the UFC, and it depends on what happens. Number one, I'd say the number one thing and the number one con in regards to getting Fedor Emelianenko into the UFC is M1 Global. Simply because that was the biggest issue in the past of the deal that never materialized and turned into anything was M1 Global, the whole idea of co-promotions and the pay and everything. That was the biggest issue of getting Fedor Emelianenko into the UFC, and that's why obviously Fedor Emelianenko went over to Strikeforce and went to different promotions simply because nothing could be done, a deal couldn't be done, and it ended up infuriating Dana White, who once considered Fedor Emelianenko, one of the greatest fighters and the biggest get, and the idea of having him fight Brock Lesnar. But it infuriated Dana White, and obviously then Dana White turns and says, Fedor Emelianenko is not the Michael Jordan of MMA when Fedor started losing, and then the interest dwindled. But Fedor Emelianenko is on a 2-fight win streak. It's not against some of the best talent. They're good fighters, but M1 Global is the biggest barrier. Can we get a deal done? Can they get a deal done in order to get Fedor into the UFC? And it will be very difficult with everything. And that's the whole thing, too. I just want to bring up something as well. I think Fedor is I personally, I'm not here to bash M1 Global either. I think Fedor Emelianenko can do just fine on his own. His name alone, he could do just fine on his own. He does not need a team. And that's the thing also, is that he is not the only person making decisions. He does not control his own destiny simply because M1 Global is a team effort. There are more people making the calls. Fedor Emelianenko does not just make all the calls of who he fights next and where he goes. The whole M1 Global thing is almost like a team and group committee of what happens next. So it's not just Fedor making the calls and calling the shots. So I think that's the biggest barrier that we face is M1 Global. And there's a couple other cons that go along with this as well. And I think one of them really is, tarnishing his legacy. Fedor Emelianenko comes over and loses. And I think that it would be bad for his legacy. And I still will always think that Fedor is one of the greatest of all time, simply just because of what he did in his career. He will always be one of the greatest of all time. But if we're talking about this legacy, every loss that he does get does hurt his legacy a little bit. It's not questioning whether he's the greatest of all time, but it does hurt his legacy as he continues to fight, and people continue to say he's one of the greatest of all time, but he continues to lose. It will tarnish his legacy. And you will get these new MMA fans or people who are new to MMA or who are doubt Fedor, it's just going to add fuel to the fire if he does continue to lose, if he does come over to the UFC and lose. However, if he does come over and win, it will only prove the doubters wrong that Fedor is more than capable of competing at the highest level. So that's just some food for thought in regards to that. And lastly, I like to bring up just a question. I bring up a question is simply that what if Fedor Emelianenko was doing what he did in Pride in the UFC? And I think it has a lot to do with the time frame. Fedor Emelianenko was doing big things in Pride, was considered one of the greatest of all time, was not losing fights, was viewed as indestructible, unbeatable, a guy that could not be matched, a guy that could not be beat in Pride, and his record showed that for multiple years. But I think it really had to do with the time frame. MMA was big. Pride was big, but MMA was nowhere near as big back then as it is now. And I think it has to do with the times, is that MMA is becoming more mainstream. And I think, what if MMA was mainstream when Fedor was doing what he was doing? I think people wouldn't be questioning Fedor's legacy and his career and what he's done. So I think, I just think it has a lot to do with the time frame. What if Fedor was doing what he was doing in Pride during this time where MMA was more mainstream? And I think there would just be people would have a different perspective about this guy that did prove himself time and time again, just at a different time frame. And it does have to do with MMA being mainstream and becoming more mainstream, because MMA was nowhere near as mainstream it was back in the Pride days than it is now. And it has to do a lot with America and just MMA becoming the fastest growing sport in the world. It's just the time frame. I just think it's, just the time frame of when Fedor was competing and when some other fighters were competing. But I think it would be people would have a lot different perspective based on it, and it's just unfortunate. So that's what I have in regards to each scenario. All the scenarios and the pros and cons in regards to Fedor Emelianenko crossing over into the UFC. If it is a possibility of a move into the UFC, hopefully M1 Global, Dana White, Fedor could all work out some sort of deal to get him over here. But people are going to need to be flexible. That's just what it's going to come down to, flexible. And quite frankly, Fedor could do this all alone. So, that's just my take on everything. So those are the pros and cons in regards to Fedor Emelianenko making the potential move into the UFC. And that's what I have for this edition of the Cage Side Couch. This is Kyle Delaney signing off.